So my connection to this next panel topic, in addition to the fact that, of course, I've been working towards gender equality for 2 decades through feminist.com and as a journalist, is that I wrote this book called What Will It Take to Make a Woman President? Conversations about Women Leadership and Power, which was inspired by a question from my then 8-year-old daughter, Lotus, after the 2008 election. She had asked me this question. We were celebrating our first African-American president. Why have we not had a woman president? And it was this really simple, innocent question, but it was this sort of lens into so many issues that affect our culture and politics. So I went out and interviewed everybody from Gloria Steinem to Nancy Pelosi to Melissa Etheridge to Sheryl Sandberg to Don McPherson to Michael Kimmel, and really trying to figure out not only why we haven't had a woman president, but why there are so few women in elected office, and really why there are so few women leaders just generally. And of all the many things that I found, one of the most important ones, and I think why it's important to have this conversation in a women and men as allies sort of context, is this isn't a women's issue. This idea of having more women in leadership, it's a human issue. It needs to be reframed. This is an issue of diversity, of having a reflective democracy. And as such, we need to have men as part of these conversations. And so that's why, I think right now we're in this amazing moment where we're actually realizing it's not just about equality. We need women there because we need their voices and their visions. We're facing a lot of serious problems. We need their input, like we were talking earlier about violence against women. You remember that visual of that all-white male panel that was talking about sexual assault in the military, or that all-white male meeting that was about women's health. This is like, we need women there. So this is urgent, and right now we're at an important moment. So that's why I'm so thankful. This is an incredible panel that I have here to talk about some of these topics today. I have Susannah Wellford, who is the founder of Running Start, and I want to say all of these people are colleagues and people I admire their work so much. Kimberly Peeler-Allen, who is the co-founder of Higher Heights. Jessica Neuwirth, who is the president of the Equal Rights Amendment Coalition, as well as Jackson Katz, who is author of Man Enough and Macho Paradox. And of course, they do so much more, so please check out and find out more about their work. And I'm going to start by first asking questions sort of specific to each of their area of expertise, and then opening it up to questions that really dig into this whole reason we're here today, to talk about women and men as allies together, and doing a sort of gender allies agenda. So I'm going to start with Susannah, because the story right now is this, well, there's a lot of stories, and Me Too and Time's Up, but since the election of Donald Trump has really been this catalyst, and there has been a huge surge of women stepping up to run for office. And that is obviously so hopeful and so exciting. But I want to find out from you, just as like a reality check, how hopeful is this trend that we're seeing, and what can we do to sort of convert this hopeful trend into true, lasting, transformative change?
Okay, well, so you all don't know me, but I am a very positive person, and I like to tell the positive, happy story. So I understand your question, but I'm a little sad that you asked me to explain it, because I do think there's been all this hype about how this is going to be the year of the women, and we are going to really be able to change things now. And for 2 reasons that I'll tell you, I don't feel very hopeful about it. So let me just tell you just briefly. So as Marianne said, I run an organization called Running Start, and we train young women, high school and college age, to want to become political leaders. So we're not doing the campaign training that's going to get them elected. We're really talking to them and saying, I want you to change how you think about politics. I want you to reframe and understand that you can do this, and that by running for elected office, you actually can make real positive change in the world. So that's what Running Start does. And so the first reason I don't feel hopeful is something very personal to Running Start. So back in 2008, Running Start was collecting applications for our high school summer program. So we're getting high school students from all over the country to apply to come to DC to learn about politics. So the previous year when we accepted applications, we got 300. It was a lot for 50 spots. We were psyched. This year, in 2008, when we were accepting applications, we got 30,000. And do you know why? So think about what was happening. Barack Obama, a black man, was running for president. We had Hillary Clinton, and yes, we had Sarah Palin, who were running on presidential tickets. And politics looked, for the first time in such a long time, really exciting and cool and inclusive, like anybody could do it. And so imagine how I felt when we knew Hillary Clinton was going to run for president in 2016. I told the staff, I'm like, okay, we have to buckle down. We got to hire new staff. We got to figure this out because this will probably be more of an onslaught. And it didn't happen. And so what I'm actually thinking is that when we see this big surge of women running for office, I think that older women, more mature women, they're motivated a lot by fear. Like, if I don't do this, then nobody's going to do it. But I think that the younger women, they're more motivated by inspiration and excitement. And politics looked so great, and this time around it did not. It did not look so great. So that's the first reason. And then the second reason is something that I bet everybody in this room read the New York Times piece the other day that was just talking about how enthusiasm is great. It's so wonderful that women are running, but our system, we like incumbents. And so if you're running in a seat that's held by somebody who it's a very safe seat, they're not going to win, no matter how good they are. That's the way the system works. So I think that we would be really wise to do some work to change that system so that we can have more diversity in. And okay, so the last part of your question is a great question. Look, as president of Running Start, I spend my day in rooms full of women talking about this stuff. I mean, always. I'm very happy for the 10 men. I think I counted. I think there are 10 men in this room. That's really refreshing, but we can't just be preaching to the choir. We have to make a good, strong, persuasive argument that this is not about, like I think Trudy said before, it's not about being fair to women or, let's make things equal for women because we deserve it. It's really about creating a stronger, better society for everybody. And that's the only thing that is ever going to make a difference. So I'll talk more about that later, but that's really what we have to change.
Thank you so much, Susannah. And I'm going to go next to Kimberly. And often this question about the need for more women in politics is framed just sort of, primarily around gender. How can we sort of look through this, bring in other intersections so that the sort of outreach, the conversation, the solutions are more interesting?
Thank you so much, and it's so good to be here with my colleagues. So I run an organization called Higher Heights, which is focused on harnessing the political power of Black women from the voting booth to elected office, because we firmly believe that when you have a wider variety of life experiences around a decision-making table, better decisions are made not just for Black women, their families, and their communities, but for the nation overall. So when we're talking about intersectionality and we're talking about inclusion and making sure that there's more women, unfortunately, women has two W's to it: women and white women. And then it is an afterthought of saying, oh, well, we need to make sure that we have Latinas and API women and Black women around the table. So I think it's incumbent on all of us who are aware of that to be very deliberate in when we're saying women, we are being very deliberate in saying all women and looking at all the variety of women and life experiences of women to make sure that they're at the table, make sure that those voices are at the table, because so often they're not. And we're seeing it's an echo chamber, which I think, as you were talking about the various hearings and committees, where it's the same demographic of our society that is making these decisions for an America that does not look like that. So that is our focus, to make sure that our voices, our votes, and our leadership are really felt in the national discourse, so that we can really improve the decisions that are being made.
Just to push it a little bit more, how can we do that? How can we, as allies, we're having a conversation about allies, really, what does that look like?
That looks like when someone's saying, oh, well, all women, or we need more women in leadership. Okay, which women are you looking at? and being very cognizant and deliberate in saying, okay, well, let me look to make sure that we have a lesbian as part of the conversation, making sure that we have a Black woman as part of the conversation. And just because, in our general day-to-day lives, we have this usual set of suspects for leadership positions going outside of our comfort zone, going outside of our regular catchment, to talk to other groups and other women, to bring them in, because there are amazing women all across this country in a variety of positions who are doing amazing work and really leading their communities that deserve a seat at that table, but they're not there because nobody has gone out to find them. Because it's not so much, I think, we all remember Mitt Romney and his binders full of women. It is not so much that we need to go find these women and put them in a binder. It's called, why don't you open your door and look beyond where you usually are, to see that all the women that are out there that are doing this work. So it's really being very deliberate and very intentional in being inclusive and saying, okay, we have 4 white women. How do we change it to 2 white women and 2 women of color, or other a differently abled woman to be part of that conversation? And it'll be absolutely amazing to see the types of decisions that come from those groups that are very purposefully intersectional.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go next to Jessica Neuwirth, and I also just want to say that Jessica, who is on the panel as president of Equal Rights Amendment Coalition, also is the co-founder of an amazing group called Equality Now, which does all kinds of amazing work globally, as well as a donor direct action. So just wanted to acknowledge all of her work. But so you've been obviously hard at work as an advocate for the ERA Coalition, and I wanted to, as part of this conversation, have you give us an update on that effort. And then definitely, the ERA is definitely one of those things that I think gets always framed as kind of this women's kind of rah-rah thing. The ERA, why is this something that men should care about and support?
Well, thanks for that. Kind of 2 questions, but let me take the first one, which is the rah-rah. Actually, a lot of people under a certain age have no idea what the ERA is. That's one of our biggest challenges, that they think it's some sports thing, or they just never heard of it. So we have to kind of start from the beginning. I'll just do a really quick overview. The Equal Rights Amendment was passed in 1972 by Congress. Very simple: equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Doesn't sound all that controversial, but 10 years later, when the deadline had expired, we still didn't have enough states that had voted to ratify it to put it in the Constitution. You need 38 or 3/4 of the states, and we had 35. And it was a really tough 10-year battle for the women's movement. And in 1982, I think what happened when the deadline expired is it just sort of fell off the radar screen. Not entirely. There are a group of people, mostly women, although not all, women, that since 1982 have been fighting consistently in little pockets, including Congress, to try to get it back on the agenda. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney from New York has been a lifelong champion of the ERA. And recently, it's been really exciting to see momentum growing again for the ERA, and more people becoming aware of it. According to our polling, 80% of Americans think we already have this in the Constitution. And I think that's because they can't imagine that we actually don't. And 94% of all Americans, regardless of geography, race, political ideology, support having an equal rights amendment. So it shouldn't be that hard, and we'll see, but it's starting to build momentum, and a lot of it is really communications, so we can get back to rah for the ERA. And I think that there were always men in the movement for the ERA. Even in the 70s, there are some prominent men that we saw, but I think a lot has changed since the 70s that should make it actually a lot easier, not to even mention the wave of Me Too that's come up recently. So currently, the situation is there are a couple of different strategies. Carolyn Maloney, after reintroducing that language I just recited, a few years ago decided, if we're going to start all over again, I want to see the word woman in the Constitution. So she added an additional sentence saying women shall have equal rights in the United States and all territories subject to its jurisdiction, and then the second sentence. That's been pending for decades, pretty much, and it's still currently now sitting in Congress. In fact, next month she's holding a shadow hearing because there's never been a real hearing, or not to mention a vote on the ERA. But more recently, about 10 years ago, the idea came up that maybe we could just remove the deadline and get a couple of more states to ratify, and that would be a shortcut. And you might have seen that recently because the state of Illinois and the Senate voted to ratify. But last year, the most amazing member of the Senate in Nevada, Pat Spearman, almost single-handedly pushed ratification through. Nobody was ever talking about Nevada, and suddenly Nevada was the first state since the 1980s to ratify. And I just have to note that she is running for Congress. I mean, if she gets there, we'll have like 10 more advocates for the ERA because that's the power that she has. But she was an amazing force that opened up the dialogue in a new way on this strategy of removing the deadline. And now it's in Illinois. The Senate voted. We're waiting to see if the Assembly will vote. What was called the three-state approach, because we only needed 3 more states according to that, is now called the two-state. If Illinois passes, it'll be 1 more state, and then we'll see. There are some legal challenges, but that could happen. So those are 2 bills pending in Congress, one to start again, which is Maloney, and another one sponsored by Jackie Speer and Ben Cardin in the Senate to remove the deadline, and we're lobbying hard for all of those. And then we also are looking at, in the ERA coalition, and I'm very thrilled to say that Kimberly is on our board and helping us with this, that we are thinking if you have to start all over again, which we may well have to, and not just only adding the word woman into the Constitution, why not broaden the amendment? Because most countries in the world that have constitutions already have prohibitions against sex discrimination, but they also have everything else, race, other things, ethnicity, nationality. So we have drafted a very comprehensive, progressive amendment that we're hoping will be introduced soon as another option that would really be an expansive intersectional approach that defines sex very broadly to include gender identity, sexual orientation, and defines race very broadly and includes basically all kinds of other forms of discrimination, so we have something really solid. Now, why should men care about it? A couple of reasons. Firstly, I think there are certain ways in which discrimination on the basis of sex does harm men. We see now more and more men taking on child care responsibilities. You just don't have the same rights in terms of parental leave and lots of other aspects. But more generally, I think the reason is inequality is bad for everyone, and equality is good for everyone. And there are so many studies that show that. And empowering women and giving women equality has an impact not only on their families, but on their communities and on their countries, on peace and security in the world. So I think that's an obvious. And then most importantly, it's simply the right thing to do. It's the principle. And for over 200 years, we've had a constitution that intentionally excluded women. Now we have this wave of Me Too and all this energy, and I think a lot of questioning about, well, what can we do to change things? And I think we need to recognize that the culture that was created when we had that constitution written by white men who own property, who intentionally left many people out, including all women, that they created a culture of second-class citizenship, which has really lent itself to the kind of discrimination and abuse that is now, kind of exploding with Me Too, saying it's, time's up. So it's been way too long, but hopefully time is up.
Great, thank you so much. And I encourage everybody to check out everyone's websites to stay in touch with what you can actually do to help with this. So now I'm going to move on to Jackson, and I want to get the name of your book right. He's written a book called Man Enough, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, and the Politics of Presidential Masculinity, and which explores issues of identity and gender and how that sort of plays out in presidential politics. So can you talk a little bit about how this past election, either proves or disproves your thesis, or were there any surprises for you?
Thank you. One is thank you very much, Marianne and Michael and fellow panelists. It's good to be on the panel with you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this great day. There's so many things to say about the 2016 election, and so much of it has been said, not necessarily in this space, but I guess I'll just add a few points that you might not hear in the mainstream conversation. So often, the discussion about Trump's ascendancy has to do with race and how it's a white backlash movement, and it's propelled by white racial resentment, which is obviously a significant and huge part of Trumpism and right-wing politics in this country more generally. But what gets short shrift in the conversation is that I don't think it's just about white resentment. I think it's about white male resentment, and I think that Trumpism is a white male identity movement. I don't think it started in 2016. I think there's lots of historical antecedents. And for example, Richard Nixon, I mean, we could start way back, but just to start a little bit more in the sort of contemporary period, Richard Nixon figured out back in between 1968 and 1972 the way to bring white males to break up the New Deal coalition by pulling white male voters away from the Democratic Party. One of the ways to do that, he couldn't give the white male electorate, if you will, economic benefits, because that would be in tension with the ownership class that runs the Republican Party. So he couldn't give them better wages or better benefits, but what he could give them is cultural recognition. And so a big part of right-wing sort of social theory and political consulting and activism was, how do you say to white men, not that we're going to give you better wages, but that we respect you, that your hard work built this country, you're patriotic, you care about your family, you care about protecting, quote unquote, your wife and children. I know it's heteronormative and it's also patronizing, but there's real stuff there. And they were fabulously successful. Nixon was fabulously successful in 1972, and since then, virtually every presidential campaign, the Republican Party has figured out, a long time ago actually, they figured out how do you get white male voters to vote against putatively their economic interests. And I think the heart of it is this cultural recognition piece. And Trumpism, and Donald Trump himself is not just a white man. He's an aggressive, bully white man. His masculinity, his sort of throwback white masculinity is a central feature of his personality. His bully personality is a central feature of his political success. When the Republican debates happened, he quickly eviscerated his fellow Republican candidates by attacking their masculinity, which sent the message to the electorate, the white electorate and the white male electorate more specifically, that being on his side is being on the side of the winner, not the feminized opponent that he ridicules and feminizes, but the real man who nobody can stand up to. And it works fabulously. But yet what happens in so much of the conversation coming out of 2016 is because white women voted for Donald Trump, although working class white women really voted for Donald Trump. White women with a college education voted for Hillary Clinton. In fact, more than any previous Democratic candidate in the past 40 or 50 years. Did you know this? That gets erased from the conversation, is that there's a historic pattern that white women had been voting Republican for decades. Hillary Clinton wasn't successful at bringing enough of them back into the Democratic fold, if you will, to win an electoral majority. But she did win 2 percentage points more than any previous Democratic candidate for president. But the point is, and I've been saying this for years, right? But last couple of years, or certainly since the election, the minute you say white male voters are the heart of the Trump movement and Trump's electoral coalition, somebody jumps in. What about white women? Which shifts the focus off of white men. Now let me just say, of course white women are part of the challenge, but white men are the central base of Trumpism and of the Republican Party. If you want numbers, in working class white men, which is defined as white men without a college education, which is a proxy for working class, 72 to 23%. Trump won, 72 to 23%. The Trump campaign from the beginning was figuring out how we can build turnout and build sort of energy and enthusiasm among the white male base. They knew that they were going to pull in white women as well. There's a 10-point gender gap between white women and white men among working class voters. You know this? There was a 10% gender gap among working class voters, where the men voted 10% more for Trump. But among white women, there was a huge class gap, because white women with a college education voted for Hillary Clinton 51 to 45, I believe, and white women without a college education voted for Donald Trump by about 30 percentage points. So there's a class gap among white women. Anyways, the point is, in terms of thinking about Trumpism, I think it has to be understood as a gender movement, not just a white racial resentment movement. And let's be clear, I mean, the social movements of the past several decades, whether it's the civil rights movements, the women's movements, the gay and lesbian movements, even the anti-war movement, all of these movements had among their central goals, if not the central goal, to decentralize white male authority. And it's not a big surprise if you take a long view that there's going to be pushback when you're trying to decenter white male authority and centrality, which has historically been, the number one, sort of social position. And in fact, whenever I see the term "Make America Great Again," Trump's slogan, which by the way, Reagan had that slogan, Nixon had that slogan. This is not a new slogan, "Make America Great Again." I read it as put white men back on center stage again, because that's really what it's saying. Put white men back on center stage. And again, if you read right-wing social theory or listen to right-wing talk radio, which I do to the point of masochism, and I have to own that, and Fox, and you'll note that there's a direct correlation made between the so-called decline of this society and the decline of white male centrality. So in other words, and by the way, this is one of the ways to explain right-wing talk radio's popularity and Fox News' popularity, because in the real world of our society, this culture is increasingly racially and ethnically diverse and sexually and gender diverse and all kinds of great things happening. But if you go to conservative talk radio or Fox News, with a couple of exceptions, it's white men pronouncing the world as it should be or as it is in a very bombastic, aggressive style that takes no prisoners and doesn't admit any weakness. And women are second-class citizens in that discourse, or they're highly sexualized like on Fox, or in Trumplandia, if you will. And that's not a secondary part of his appeal, of the appeal of these media precincts. It's like when you go to right-wing talk radio or Fox News, you get the world as you, if you're in a conservative mindset, as you wish it would be, not as it is. And it's been amazingly effective.
So since I'm very solutions-based right now and thinking, because we're talking about the election and the moment that we're in, and we're also talking about how we can bring, whether it's men into the conversation of feminism, very briefly, because I want to get to the questions about the allies, how can we appeal to, engage, have this conversation about white men without somehow shortchanging, the gains and the goals of the feminists, the progressive, the gay rights movements? How can we deal with it?
That's a great question. It's the central question the Democratic Party hasn't been able to solve for 50 years. The Democratic Party, since the early 1970s, has not been able to come up with a good answer to that particular question. How do you incorporate the needs of ascendant minorities, quote unquote, and racial and ethnic minorities who are seeking to be treated with full equal justice, women, et cetera, gay and lesbians, bisexual, transgender, and keep white men in the fold? And I mean, honestly, this is what I'm working on. And Michael works on this question, and many of us have been writing about this subject, trying to get into the mainstream discourse with these basic ideas. How do you do it? I mean, I can give you just one quick answer to it, because there's more to it. But you have to speak to those white men. You have to say, look, we want you to be part of this coalition. It doesn't mean you're going to be back on center stage. It means that you're part of a progressive coalition that's going to build a more healthy society and a more racially and ethically just society. And you have an important role to play as an ally, as a leader, not just as an ally, but as a leader. And we want you to be part of that. And in fact, we need you to be part of that. And one other way to think about it, by the way, this is more big picture thinking. It's evolutionarily necessary for this all to happen, because we are killing ourselves as a species on the current path that we're on, and it's not adaptive to reality to try to pretend that we're going to go back to some romanticized past. That's for short-sighted and kind of weak people, if you will. I hate to say it like that, but it's kind of weak. It's like, to be strong is to say, how do we adapt to the current reality and be the most successful going forward? Because the old ways aren't going to work, because they don't work. And by the way, climate change is a classic example of this. Climate change is real. The U.S. military says it's real. It's hardly some radical left-wing conspiracy to say that climate change is real. And yet, you say to men, look, you're not being proper stewards of the environment. You're actually not being responsible. You're not being evolutionarily adaptive to the reality of the times that you live in, unless you do join with these folks and build progressive coalitions to go to the next level.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, there's a lot in that, I think, to unpack. So when I was doing the interviews for my book, while there were a lot of, and we've talked about some of the structural obstacles, there were to women being in politics, being a woman president, being in leadership generally, there are also so many sort of cultural and even psychological obstacles, first of all, for women and girls seeing themselves as leaders in the first place. And then related to that is also men seeing women as leaders. And the media's, obviously has a role in this. But I guess my question is, I guess to all of you, how can we, change the kind of culture and socialization so that, we do see women as leaders? Because actually, a lot of people talked about, and this is like, an oxymoron for girls who were raised to be pleased and be liked, that actually powerful, ambitious, confident women are seen in a negative light. So how can we change how girls and women see themselves, but also how men perceive women leaders? And I'll just throw it out to all of you for, brief comments since of our time.
I would say what we've been doing a lot of is just calling it out. We actually just released a letter to the editor of the New York Times because there was a really abhorrent article written about a black woman who is seeking public office, and it completely just ignored the fact her legislative record, her background, her education experience, all of that, and just said that basically she was a political hack, and she had no reason to ascend to this position or to even be considered for this position. And all of the things that they highlighted, they never would have highlighted about a man. And we wrote a letter to the editor of the Times. Of course, they chose not to run it, but calling people out at every single time you see it is just critically important, and it is absolutely exhausting to do it, but it must be done, because until we catch ourselves, because we all have these implied biases that we don't even necessarily are aware of, but until we are at the point where we're catching ourselves and are comfortable catching others and calling them out for the sexist statements, the inequities, like you would never comment on a male candidate's shoes, never ever, never. There was a story about Marco Rubio because he wears lifts, but beyond that, there would never have been a comment about, oh, those shoes don't match that dress or they don't match that suit. Those things are completely irrelevant. And talking about a woman's qualifications or how she is a passionate advocate, we want leaders who are passionate advocates. We're not going to see them as angry or aggressive. We want that. That's what we're electing them to do. So why use such derogatory terminology that you would never put on a man?
And now mysteriously works. So I totally agree with you, and that is a good segue to what I was going to say, which is that my job is to work with young women to catch them at a really early age to change their mindsets about their capabilities. So they've been told, socialized, that men are the leaders, that they're not supposed to raise their hand, they're not supposed to be bold, and so Running Start is one of the groups that is saying, you can do this, you should do this. I know you think this way, and a lot of other women think this way too, but you should change that way of thinking because you can do more. And I just believe so strongly that starting early is the key for men. And I come at this from a totally personal place, because even though I spent all my days with young women, I have two teenage boys. They're twins. They're just about to graduate from high school in like a week. And so they've been sort of my control group. As I train the young women, I look at what's happening with them and how they think about themselves and their own capabilities. And I know for a fact that they have grown up thinking so radically differently about women's capabilities because they have had me as a mom, right? And I drag them to everything. But, as I'm sure you did too. But I think that the other thing is, I don't just want my boys to know that women should think outside the box and get outside the box and do things that traditionally women haven't done. I really desperately want them to know that they can do this too. And so the biggest gift they ever gave me was in August. I just casually said, "So what classes did you guys sign up for?" And they both had signed up for a Women and Gender Studies course. I mean, I didn't know about it, right? And we had so many incredible conversations because they're white, privileged, straight boys, and they'd never realized that before. And so the conversations that we had about how they were learning to see the world differently and learning to look at people unlike themselves in a different way, it just cannot tell you. I mean, and to this day, you know, that was earlier this year, we still have those conversations. That's what we need more of. So we spend so much time training and talking to girls about, you know, be all you can be. But boys, I honestly, like everything that you said in the previous panel, I feel so deeply for boys because I know that the traps that men are in to try, you know, to live up to these masculine ideals. And one of my boys in particular, I see him struggle with this absolutely all the time. And somebody has got to, I mean, they've got to read your book, and we need more groups that are actually targeting these boys, because that will be the answer.
I would just add to that. I mean, when I've been talking to people about the ERA, it's really interesting to talk to fathers of like 20-something-year-old women, because I think that they're in the generation where maybe, you know, they remember, you know, Bobby Riggs. Like, I don't think there's any more Bobby Riggs really that are going to stand up and say, "I'm a chauvinist pig and I'm really proud of it." Like, the closest maybe you get is Donald Trump. And he doesn't say that. Like, it's just different. And there's been this sort of steady progress that we have to recognize and really thank, I think, the generation of mothers that came out of the 70s. And really all that consciousness raising paid off because there's different men than there used to be and different boys. But those fathers that I talk to are so outraged when their girls enter the workforce. And they're facing the normal discrimination that all these women know about, and they're like, outraged, and the mothers aren't that outraged because they totally know that's what happens. So I think that's a force, and the kind of what was referred to as sort of social, cultural status or power, I think that comes from economic and political power, and we just need to take it back or equalize it, and that's also happening. So even though we only have 20% of women in Congress, it's still more than it's ever been. More women on corporate boards, more this, more that, more women in the workforce. And I think that all of that will continue, hopefully accelerate, and it will just inherently change the dynamics. So on this, I'm really very much of an optimist.
Do you want to weigh on this? Just very briefly.
I think we need to redefine what it means to be strong, and that incorporates women's strength as well as deconstructs the traditional notion of men's strength. So, for example, Donald Trump is a caricature of strength. The idea that Donald Trump is a strong man, that we should look to as a strong man in the 21st century, is some of us are just so honestly deflated by that because it's so deflating to think that 63 million people actually endorsed that idea at the last election, whereas he's a walking like caricature of what Michael and myself and a whole bunch of other people have been writing about for decades, which is this sort of caricature of traditional white masculinity. But if you redefine strength, not as the ability to impose your will over other people, but there's a complex way, moral courage, social courage, standing for justice, standing and speaking out even when it's not going to be a popular thing to do, a lot of men can respond positively to that. And it also opens up space for women because you don't have to be big and strong and beat your chest to be strong. In fact, that's only one very narrow way of looking at it. And so if you can expand the definition of what you think or what we know leadership in the 21st century requires, then it by definition brings in women and, by the way, men who don't meet the hegemonic definition of strength. Because there's all kinds of men who aren't chest-beating bullies, who are strong leaders. And so it's an inclusive message in that way.
Thank you so much. Actually, that's one of, I think, the hopes we have is also if women do wind up increasing their numbers, is that they're going to bring their authentic selves. They're going to model new paradigms of leadership and power. That's why we need women, which might open up for men to do that too. I just feel we've been talking about a lot of generations. So I want to give a quick shout out to my daughter, Jasmine Kay, who is here, who is 20. And I really feel so hopeful by what I see in my daughters and the younger generations who see these, I think, right? Like with your sons, I feel so much hope that the future generations see things in a just, much more positive lens. So as a last question, and I'm sorry that I'm going to have to ask you all to be very brief on this, but I think it's really important and speaks to why we're here today. How can, for men who want to be a part of making this change, how can women include men into this work so that they can, be helpful allies? And also, I guess, and also as a second part, if you want to weigh in quickly on, how can we reframe that men who do support feminist work or women's equality, it's seen as a symbol of, courage, and also that this is something that benefits them too, because we do need men as allies. So just, any quick thoughts and comments?
I just have a quick story. My son, one of my sons, when he was 5 or 4, he actually cried one night because he realized for the first time that he couldn't be the mommy. He couldn't give, this is a true story, it's kind of interesting, but maybe he was a little bit younger. But men do, they see the power in us too. Like, we have so many wonderful things to give, but as has been pointed out, they're supposed to deny that. That's that other side of themselves. Women are supposed to embrace it. Men are supposed to hide it. So that didn't really answer your question. And the real answer to your question, I think, is women's groups often will, like, for example, with Running Start, I remember the conversation when we first decided to add men to the board, and people were pissed. They did, the female board members were like, no way, they get everything. Why would we let them be a part of this? So now we have a lot of male board members. We bring in male speakers. You have to, the people who run these groups have to make it an inclusive space for men and say, we want your help. We want you as allies.
I have a slightly different view on that. I think it's fine to bring men into these spaces, but it doesn't seem to me like the top priority. I think we have so much work cut out for us, and when men are like, how can we help or whatever, I feel like the people that are our biggest problem are men. And the people that are best placed to reach men are other men. So that's a huge universe that's out there that men should really be in the forefront of organizing. And we need to organize women, and we need to get women in office. And we need to deal with these white women that are voting for people like Trump. And I think we have a pretty full agenda, and maybe men can help us with that. But to me, the highest priority for men is other men, because that's where we have the hardest time.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what has already been said. One of my really good friends who actually encouraged Glenda Carr, my co-founder, and I to start Higher Heights, he said, if you want something said, you ask a man. If you want something done, you ask a woman. And he saw in us the potential to untap the political power of Black women across the country, and he pushed us forward, and he's been one of our strongest allies and strongest supporters, and he has been that ally who goes and talks to other men about the importance of our work and what it means, not just for the women in their lives, because everybody has a mother, but also what it means for the broader community, and how because it's so easy to get pitted against each other. Oh, you're all about Black women, but what about the Black boys? Well, it all is together. Black mothers are concerned about their Black sons, and Black sons are concerned about their Black mothers. So how do we use that to support and engage and use the privilege that our allies have to elevate the voices of others and support other leaders and be very inclusive and deliberate in that work.
Thank you. Well, it's impossible to do justice to how big this question is and how important it is. More of these, absolutely. But in short, if only a small number of men were peeled back from who had been peeled away from the New Deal coalition are brought back into voting for progressive candidates, we would be able to do all the progressive things we want to do. I mean, we're not going to convert all these white male voters who have been moving over to the Republican Party for the past 40 or 50 years. But if only a small percentage of them came back and started voting for progressive Democratic candidates, we would have the governing coalition that could enact all the progressive legislation that many of the people in this room want to see happen. So it's not, I don't think it's a wasted effort. I agree with Jessica's point that men need to be doing this work, but I think we need to be holding men accountable in the Democratic Party, in the progressive movements, who claim to care about social justice, except when it comes to gender. They're much more interested in focusing on, whether it's class or sometimes racial justice, which obviously are important, and people like me are, it's all intersectional. But a lot of those men in progressive social movements, when it comes to gender, they lose their voice. They don't know what to say. They're a tepid liberal at best. When they're a radical on race, they're a radical on class inequality. But when it comes to gender, all of a sudden, they don't. So I think some of our organizing efforts need to be in people in positions of leadership already in the Democratic Party and the progressive social movements, not just small programs that feed. I mean, I think it's critical that we have young people involved at every level. But I think we need to be starting to hold people accountable, white men accountable at a higher level, to be more educated on these matters, to be more literate on these matters, and to be more vocal on these matters. And by the way, it's very similar to men's violence against women, which is the focus of much of my work. It's like men commit the vast majority of violence against women. White men hold the vast majority of social, political, and economic power. We're not going to make transformative change until we engage those men, but we're not going to engage them until we start talking to them directly and saying, we need you, not we want you, we need you, and we don't hope that you help us. We expect you to help us. And if you want to be part of a progressive social movement, you can't just check your white male privilege, if you will. You have to be there in all ways. And I think that, and one last point, class is the subtext for all of this, right? So socioeconomic class. We have to be cognizant of that. When we're talking about white men, and Michael's written about this for years, working class white men who feel like the bargain that their fathers had given them or whatever, it wasn't working out for them because of various structural realities. This isn't just powerful white men of privilege who need to do more child care, and I would count myself in that category. Right? We do need to do more child care and more of the traditionally feminine household labor and everything. I appreciate that. But I think we do need to speak to some of the class dynamics in this country as income inequality grows and figure out a way to speak to those men, not just about their class privilege, the way that they've been hurt by them losing ground, if you will, as working class men, but as in a gendered sense. And I think I have this experience, I'll end with my own personal experience of talking to men and working with men across class, race, ethnicity, and I spend huge amounts of time in the red states, giving lectures, on panels, meeting with people. Men respond positively to a lot of what I've been saying, and a lot of what Michael says. It's not like the men are resistant when they hear this. They don't hear it. They don't hear it, and the echo chamber of right-wing media and the failures of progressive men and white men in media to have these conversations is what many of these men are responding to. Because we get a lot of people saying, yeah, I never heard it like that. That's the way you put it, I agree with that. And these are potential allies. So I think we need to figure out ways to speak to them and ways to hold media accountable for not centering some of those voices in the way that needs to happen.
Okay, well, thank you all so much, and I definitely encourage everyone to check out all of their websites, read their books, check out whatwillitTake.com. I've got a whole platform that's, a lot of these organizations are listed at, and I'm going to be doing all sorts of events, including an event around women in politics in October at NYU. One important thing we can all do is vote and really get out there with these midterm elections. This is one of the most important elections of our lifetime. So I'm going to step into sort of also being a little bit of MC, because I'm going to say, huge thanks to everybody on this panel. Let's give them a round of applause. And I know they probably want to take a quick picture, but then I'm going to also call up my co-partners on this so that we can sort of close out this amazing afternoon. So thank you all. So.